In this episode of The Bitey End of the Dog, we're tackling a topic that can stir up strong opinions in the dog world, which is breeding. But instead of debating sides, this conversation looks at something we don't talk about enough, which is how breeder decisions can shape behavior outcomes for the rest of a dog's life. My guest is Kate Dalman, and she brings a perspective that connects the dots between breeding practices, puppy development, and the behavior challenges many trainers end up working with years later. We talk about how temperament selection, early socialization, and matching the right puppy with the right home can dramatically influence long-term success. We also explore the divide that often exists between breeders, trainers, and rescue organizations, and why more collaboration across these groups could make a real difference in preventing behavior issues and reducing shelter intake. Kate is the founder of Herzog's Heroes, a nonprofit focused on preventing dogs from entering shelters by raising standards in dog breeding, placement, and lifelong breeder responsibility. With over 20 years of first-hand experience as a breeder, Kate brings a rare perspective to conversations about canine behavior, connecting how breeder decision-making directly influences behavioral outcomes later in a dog's life. Her work centers on reducing the prevalence of serious behavioral issues, including aggression, through transparency, accountability, and proactive breeding practices that set dogs and owners up for long-term success. And before we jump into today's episode, a quick heads up. If you're looking to learn more about helping dogs with aggression issues, head over to aggressivedog.com. For pet professionals, there's the Aggression in Dogs Master Course, which is the most comprehensive program available on aggression, packed with expert insights and continuing education credits. For dog guardians, check out Real Life Solutions, which is a practical course covering everyday challenges like leash reactivity and dog-to-dog aggression. You can also join the Ultimate Access membership for just $29 per month, which gives you access to expert webinars, live mentor sessions, and exclusive discounts. And don't forget to check out the Canis Conference happening this October in Schaumburg, Illinois, which is going to be the world's largest conference dedicated to dog behavior, training, science, veterinary care, dog sports, scent work, and shelter and rescue. That can all be found at aggressivedog.com. Hey everyone, welcome back to The Bitey End of the Dog. This week we have Kate Dalman from Herzog's Heroes here, and this episode is going to be all about breeding, and I know it's really important to many of the listeners in our audience about where we're getting dogs from and what can happen with dogs that have behavior issues, of course, when we're talking about aggression as the focus of this show. So I'm really excited to jump into this conversation because I think this is a conversation that is sorely needed in our industry. So welcome to the show, Kate.
Thank you so much for having me.
So let's get right into it. So it's maybe some people haven't heard of your organization and kind of why you started. So give us a little background about what got you into this. Like, what was your motivation and what does the organization do now?
Yeah. So I got my start as a breeder 20 plus years ago. And I found that back then there weren't really many breeder support channels. There, if you went on a forum, you would find that you were met with a lot of hostility. It was difficult to really learn how to breed well on your own. So that's why a lot of breeders, I think, they gravitate towards not even asking questions. They go towards just learning on their own, trial and error. I really started to look at what breeders like me could have used back then and just seeing like the differences between, starting off as a breeder, just not having a whole lot of support and, deciding that like we needed to design some things to help support breeders. And then as we moved along, and Herzog's Heroes was formed, I started looking more at what other countries are doing and how they have systems in place where, these countries don't actually even use spay neuter or things like that often, and they have very low shelter populations. So countries like Sweden and Germany and Switzerland take a look at those and say, well, why are they able to do it well? And when we really look at it, they have a cultural mindset that is very different from here. And it's that breeding is an honorable profession and it's treated as such. And so breeders are educated and supported. And here, it's treated as more immoral, and it's difficult for a good breeder to really feel supported and find the educational support that they need. And so what happens is that here in the United States, we find that a lot of unqualified people are breeding. And that's not to say that we don't have qualified people breeding in the United States, but it does attract a lot of people that are unprepared and maybe even have good intentions, but just don't really know what they should be doing. So that's really where Herzog's Heroes was born, is just my own personal, failures and successes and things that I felt that I could have used along the way as far as support systems go. And then really digging into like what systems we need in place here that can help really prevent dogs from entering shelters in the long run.
Where did you get the name Herzog's Heroes from? So what's the story on that?
Yeah, Herzog is my first stud, and I loved him absolutely beyond all else. And I bred him. I was super proud of him. And just along the way, I really realized that he was a dog that shouldn't have been bred. His puppies, thankfully, all had wonderful homes and they all had good success stories in the end. But Herzog was a dog with behavioral issues that for a German Shepherd, I assumed were just, protection and things like that. But what it really was he didn't have a balanced temperament. And that's not what we want in a German Shepherd. And so breeding him really opened my eyes. And it took a long time for me to realize, breeders have something that they deal with, and it's called kennel blindness. And it's where you can make decisions about the dogs that you're going to breed out of love or out of, worrying about, trying to fill deposits or, just reasons that, you shouldn't choose to breed two parents. So that was actually one of the biggest eye openers for me. And so that was, just kind of made sense that it was Herzog's Heroes.
Yeah, it's a good way to honor him. Yeah. So when we talk about there's these terms that get thrown around in the industry, and it reminds me actually what you're saying there is that the information there wasn't a lot of information, or you're kind of afraid to stick your head out to even ask questions. It reminded me of the parallels of the dog training industry, and so much of also the parallels of dog training and behavior in those countries you're mentioning are so much different than what we have here in the U.S. But one of the terms that gets used a lot when and this is kind of new to the dog training world too, is that the idea of ethical breeding or breeding for behavior, which we as trainers love, of course. But talk us through that term or maybe some other terminology you might use.
Yeah, so actually we are trying to get away from the term ethical breeding. Ethical breeding is essentially supposed to mean that a breeder is, doing their due diligence to breed to the highest moral standard they possibly can. And the reason we want to get away from that term and move toward the term conscientious breeding is because ethical breeding is more of it's like a self-proclamation, and it means something different to everyone. So where one person can call themselves ethical, it means one thing, and then another person calls themselves ethical and it means something totally different. And we find that it's really, really difficult for, a potential puppy buyer to be able to wade through, good breeders versus bad breeders, and what we see is that, every breeder really describes their program differently. There's no apples to apples, information as far as, how temperaments are tested or how they describe those temperaments, of the parents and of the puppies. And so what we find is that a lot of people end up buying their puppies based on whichever breeder has the slickest tongue, and that doesn't necessarily make them the best breeder. And then they also purchase puppies based on timing and really pretty pictures. So when we look at conscientious breeding, what we've been trying to define is what makes a breeder really stand out, and what are those things that we really want to see breeders doing, so then it really comes down to things like, what are their long-term plans? What are their how do they support their owners? How do they prepare their owners? How do they match their puppies to their owners? How are they choosing their parents? Long-term care. And we have placed a really heavy significance on breeders that will always accept their dogs back. We feel that that is a duty of a conscientious breeder to accept that dog back, if they ever need it at any stage in life, to avoid a dog from ever entering a shelter. But having that mindset for a breeder, it's not easy. If you're breeding from your home and you have to think about, what's it going to look like if a 3-year-old dog gets returned to me and I don't have, room for it? And is it going to get along with my other dogs and my family? And what is that going to look like? So for a small breeder, having plans like that in place, which is what we try to help develop, that is crucial, and when you've got a breeder with a mindset of, okay, I have to know that a dog could always come back to me at any time, then their game plan shifts. It's like, then they look at potential owners a little more carefully. They're not, allowing impulse buyers or people that are underprepared to get their pups. And they're also trying to just match the right owner with the right puppy from the beginning. So we see the breeders that are practicing these things have much higher success rates for their pups in their homes long term. And so those are the types of things that we really emphasize, is just how can we set owners up for long-term success and support them, as they go along, because a growing puppy goes through a lot of changes and it can be difficult.
Again, going back to the parallels to the training industry, you were talking about, as a consumer or somebody looking to get a puppy or somebody looking for training advice, it's really difficult to know quality from not, and there's no regulation in the training industry. So talk us through, well, let me start with this part. Let's get back to what qualities or standards, would make for a conscientious breeder. And I will say to the audience, I had the privilege of reviewing the program that Kate is developing, and the behavior and the behavioral aspect of it, meaning the what you're looking for, was very impressive, very thorough, very impressive, very well thought out. So,
thank you.
So talk us through some of those. What qualities? You mentioned some of the qualities, and when people think breeders, we want to see good health, of course. But talk us through some of the behavior stuff and other qualities that you're mentioning, like taking the dog back at any time and those kind of things, in addition to those things. Yeah.
Well, I think when we look at behavior, the behavior end of it specifically, and we do have several other things that, qualify somebody to be a conscientious breeder. But when we look at the behavior end of it, it's so important to choose parent dogs that have the right temperaments. But I think a lot of breeders don't know, the breeders that maybe are newer to it or just haven't had the guidance that they need. They don't really take into consideration that the, parent dogs need to be matched with complementary temperament parent dogs, or not even just temperament, also, conformation and health. So we have to look at how those parents as a whole are going to, what that litter will produce. So if you have two parents that are really, really sweet dogs, but maybe a little on that tenderhearted side, and you match them together thinking, I'm just going to get the sweetest puppies ever. Well, you also are risking having, a litter of puppies that are just too far on that tenderhearted side and toward the fearful side. So we want to try to match parents that we've got puppies that are balanced. We also want to avoid in utero stress so that we don't have puppies that are born, out of that stressed, situation. We want to match puppy owners with the right puppy. And I can't stress that one enough, because I've seen from my own personal early years, choosing owners that were just absolutely wonderful, kind people. And I just thought, this is going to be a wonderful fairy tale story. This puppy is going to have a wonderful life with these really wonderful people. and then come to find out, well, you know what, you matched this puppy with people that, you know, were maybe not placing the right boundaries that the puppy needed, or not capable of building confidence where this puppy needed. So I think when you look at what you want the long-term success of your puppies to be, you have to take temperament of not only the puppy, but the owners and what their household looks like and their life looks like in order to try to match properly. So I think that that's another really important factor.
So some trainers look for breeders that do a lot of preliminary socialization, handling, those kind of things, preparing them for aspects of their life that are that can tend to be challenges from a behavioral aspect. You know, that's trainers, the cases that we work with, maybe a puppy or a dog that doesn't like their nails trimmed or their ears cleaned, or they're afraid of this or that because they weren't exposed to it early on, or like we've all heard of puppy mill stories where the dog doesn't even know what grass feels like. So what do you look for there when you're talking about conscientious breeding?
Well, so we feel like breeders that have, you know, written protocols are going to be really important. And actually, when we're looking at conscientious breeding, a lot of what we're trying to look at is not that we want to see things that can be proven and written and just, I mean, you know, we don't want to just take people's word for, you know, that they're doing these things. So, you know, what we like to see are, you know, what is your written protocol for early socialization, early stimulation, and there are different programs out there that are acceptable to use. So we aren't trying to tell every breeder that they need to do things exactly the same. We, you know, think that breeding programs, you know, do need to vary in being unique in their own way. But yeah, we want to see that, you know, that they do have a solid written protocol and what systems they prefer to use. And then we take a look and say, okay, well, you know, maybe we can give some recommendations on things that you can do to enrich that program. Because, you know, again, some of these programs are lacking, and some breeders, you know, they've kind of figured out like, hey, this is what I like to do. It's not a specific program that I'm using, but, you know, we want to be able to offer help and guidance, to try to, you know, have the most robust program possible.
Yeah. What about, because you had mentioned someone really looking at the person that's coming to get a puppy and their environment, their home. But let's talk about dogs bred for certain purposes. So working dogs, so working border collies or working Malinois or something like that. Is there any other guardrails that you suggest be put in place so that way that somebody is not just seeing the Belgian Malinois in a Disney movie is going to come over and be like, I love Belgian Malinois, but they don't know what they're getting into?
Yeah. You know, actually, we see, you know, obviously see a lot of issues like that where, you know, people have been mismatched because they saw a dog on a movie that they really liked. You know, you see a Belgian Malinois video and you're like, holy cow, that dog is amazing. I want that. So, yeah, we do see that a lot. And we believe that when we see the breeders, a lot of breeders are out there that they have the utmost confidence in their dogs, and they believe that with enough training, any owner can do well. And that's not necessarily the case, because some owners are just not going to have that time or that personality to be able to, you know, do what they need to do to support that dog and make them the best dog they can possibly be. So we feel like, you know, working lines need extra attention. Breeders need to be especially focused on, you know, the capability and the time commitment and things like that the potential owners are willing to give. And so we do think that that's really important. I think that some breeders, since they're used to it, it's normal for them, it's normal behavior for them, I think they may forget that it's not normal for everybody to have a dog that has high drive in their house, and it's not attainable for all of those people to be able to, you know, handle that. That's a dog that requires somebody that's really capable of giving them everything they need.
In thinking through, I'm kind of putting myself in a breeder's seat right now, but how do you guys handle or cope with the challenges of somebody gets a dog from you, and let's put it just the words, so that they screw it up, right? So they do something with training or the environment or something that they're just like, the dog learns like aggression, like for whatever reason they set the environment. They did something and the dog's biting people now. and now you are tasked with taking that dog back. What's your thought process and how do your feelings go with that?
Okay. Yeah, this is a big question because
Mm-hmm.
so for me as a, I always was a, private breeder, didn't have a big kennel facility. So when I have had a dog returned, and thankfully I've had a very low return rate, but when a dog is returned, you usually only have about 12 to 24 hours notice that the dog is going to be coming back. And so knowing how difficult that is and how stressful that can be for the dog and for the all the people in the house, and you're trying to, prepare for this dog to come home and give them the support they need. It just kind of reminds me how crucial it is to have these kind of game plans set up and how to, have your soft landing plan prepared and what does it look like to, where is this dog going to stay? How are you going to socialize with your other animals? How are you going to integrate them in a way that is going to help benefit them? I think a lot of people don't realize, how hard it can be to say, okay, now I'm going to just be prepared for this dog at any time. And I think that as a breeder, when you do have that mindset and you do have that understanding that is something that is, we believe it's your duty to that dog that you brought into the world to always be willing to accept them back. Once you have that mindset, then you look at things differently. You look at your placements differently. You want to make sure that your owners are prepared for the dog that you've got. Like for me, if I have a puppy that has a little more high drive, I want to make sure that their owners are prepared. If I have a puppy that's a little more tenderhearted, I want to make sure my owners understand that they're going to be working on building confidence, because getting that dog back at 3 years old or 4 years old, whatever, and they are now a basket case, and you're trying to work on all these behaviors and then finding them a suitable home. That is a challenge that I think any breeder who's ever dealt with that or has ever really thought that through wants to avoid having that happen. And the best way to do that is to choose your parent dogs properly from the day one, match properly, match your parents properly. Again, avoid the in utero stress. And then it really boils down to matching your puppies with the proper owners. And then, of course, long-term support for those owners when they do go through those rough puppy stages. So I think as a breeder, you have to be looking at like the big picture from day one and what your responsibilities are, and that those responsibilities do not end at the sale of the dog. And I think that if we can kind of get that cultural mindset shift, then we're going to start seeing breeders behaving more honorably, but also the public starting to see breeding as something that's a more honorable profession.
Yes. You have such a great way of answering questions, because I can tell it comes from such a place of, nobody told me this stuff before, so now I need to get it out there to everybody else. I recognize it so much, and I appreciate it so much, because even right now I'm learning so much about this. So thank you for answering the questions in the way you do. And you were talking about responsibility, and I kind of want to jump back to other countries and the differences and sort of I don't know if we would call them laws or regulations, or even how people approach animal welfare and their views of animals. But what are some of the significant differences between, like, say, Switzerland or Germany and the US, and I guess limitations or restrictions placed on producing dogs or breeding dogs? Like, what do you say is the most significant factor or some of the significant factors that are most helpful to see that kind of dynamic?
Well, I would say the biggest thing is that there is definitely a very different cultural mindset there. So each of those countries, like Germany, Switzerland, Sweden, they all have like different, they all handle breeding differently. Some of them don't necessarily spay and neuter their dogs, and they don't have shelters overrun with dogs. They certainly aren't euthanizing dogs for space in shelters. So what is if you really look at, like, okay, they've got some of them have regulations, some of them have breeder educational programs. They've all got something a little different going on. What is the main thing that you go back to, though, is that they have a cultural mindset that breeding is an honorable profession. And so what that does is that means that they're setting up breeders for success with their, educational programs or things like that. And breeders that are qualified are attracted to the field because it's a field that people can feel good about being in. Here, we have this issue where breeding is treated as immoral. It's a bad word, and breeders can't necessarily hold their heads high. And so, although we do, as I said earlier, we have a number of qualified breeders in the United States, the numbers of unqualified breeders far outweigh that. And I'm not saying that unqualified breeders are bad people. I think a lot of them started out just like me, where I just didn't know where to turn. I actually, when I started breeding, I, tried to learn as much as I could about it. And, I contacted AKC and I said, okay, I've got these 2 AKC registered dogs and, I want to breed them. What do I do? And, I was I was told over the phone, oh, just send your registrations in and, we'll when the litter arrives, send the parent registrations in. And we will, we'll send you the litter certificates. And I was like, oh, okay. Now I'm going to tell you how ignorant I was back then to how this all works. I thought that meant that my dogs already had met some rigorous standards just by being in this bloodline that the AKC was keeping track of. And I did not understand that it was just tracking their lineage. I did not get that. And I think a lot of breeders miss that. But then I went in and I took my dogs to the vet and I said, okay, I want to breed these dogs. What do you think? And my vet said, yeah, they're healthy to breed. Well, I didn't know back then, I was young. I had no idea back then that genetic testing was very different from a vet health check, right? And so a lot of these things I learned the hard way along the way. And, and my heart was always in the right place. I always wanted to do better. And it always really hurt, hearing people, just, talk down about breeders and that feeling of like, I was doing something immoral or wrong when it was something that I just loved so dearly. And so I think that when we see, this mindset here, I think that we can do so much more good if we can, switch that mindset. And I do have to say that, we have to remember that there are many, many dogs in shelters. And so the mindset that we have here, it comes with good reason. There are people every day working in shelters trying to, pick up the pieces of, breeders who haven't stuck through and haven't been there to support their dogs, or accidental breedings, or, any number of reasons why these dogs are ending up in shelters. But when we look at the situation, we look at the numbers of dogs out there. There are about 100 million dogs in the United States, they estimate, something like, 90 to 100 million, depending on, where you're looking at your numbers. And then you look at the fact that we've got a turnover rate, like we have dogs passing every year that, about 10, you can guess, if they've got an average lifespan of about 10 to 13 years, then we can look at every year, we've got about 10% of dogs passing away. And then you look at the millions and millions of people out there that are actively looking for dogs every day. So what it boils down to is not necessarily that we've got an overpopulation issue. It's more that we don't have systems in place to set these puppies up that are brought into the world up for long-term success. And to do that, to change this, to see this endless supply of dogs stop going into shelters and being supported long-term. To do this, we need a cultural mindset shift, and we need to put systems in place to, make it so that breeders are able to support their dogs long-term.
Really, really well said. So such excellent points there. And I want to ask you about adopt, don't shop when you hear those words. But I'm going to take a little moment to take a break and hear a word from our sponsors, and we'll be right back. What if there was a way to help both shelter animals and veterans struggling with emotional trauma by engineering a powerful, near instantaneous bond between them? That's exactly what Pets for Vets, a nonprofit focused on positive reinforcement for animals and veterans, is designed to do. Pets for Vets' unique program model creates a super bond, which is a carefully crafted, professionally trained version of love at first sight that leads to a lasting connection between a veteran and a shelter animal.
Because each animal is evaluated and selected to match the veteran's specific personality, lifestyle, and emotional needs, the result is a reciprocal, healing relationship. The organization, founded by Clarissa Black, is expanding its network of highly skilled, well-qualified positive reinforcement trainers. It offers an incredibly rewarding opportunity for trainers who grow professionally, enjoy flexible schedules, receive stipends, and can live anywhere in the United States. Pets for Vets is also seeking new collaborations with animal shelters and rescue organizations across the U.S. to help us find the right dogs. To learn more or get involved, visit petsforvets.com.
All right, we're back here with Kate Dalman. We were talking about all things breeding, and we left off before the break talking about those words, adopt, don't shop. And we're not going to jump into criticizing anyone here. It's just those particular words, though, we hear sometimes in our industry. What are your thoughts on that? And when you hear that, and of course, the what can happen when we start getting into those conversations? So, and how does that affect you?
Well, again, given that there are, millions of dogs in shelters, adopt, don't shop, I completely see, why it's a valid phrase. And it's an important thing to keep in mind, but when we look at the system, the bigger picture, the issue, again, is not necessarily overpopulation. It's that we don't have systems in place to take care of the dogs that we have. So if a person is out there looking for a dog, either the dog in the shelter isn't specifically what they're looking for, or the shelter is not allowing them to adopt. So those are two big issues about why people choose to go to a breeder. So when we look at the term adopt, don't shop, in my mind, what always comes instead is breed better, shelter less. Because what we want to do is stop the flow of dogs going into shelters. And I feel like if, you take that mindset of if all breeders would just stop breeding, then shelters would empty out. And what we would immediately see, given the fact that we have such a demand for dogs, and that the dog populations, again, are, 100 million in the United States, and we've got about 2 to 3 million in shelters, and then we've got about 10 to 15 million passing away every year, what we would see immediately is that the shelters would empty out. And then we would see a black market of dogs coming around with probably very poor breeding standards. And we would see a lot of, people trying to import dogs because the demand for dogs wouldn't go away. And what would happen then is, we'd see a boom in breeders coming back and people that are probably not qualified. We would see strain in do we have well-bred or purebred dogs anymore? But then the issue is going to come back because we haven't put systems in place. So the shelters will end up filling up again because we don't have the systems in place that we need. So while adopt, don't shop, or the thought of all breeding should just stop, on its face seems like it makes a ton of sense. When you really look at the bigger picture and what systems we're lacking and what systems we absolutely can put in place, those are things that we're working on right now. The solution is not as simple as just, putting it like that.
Yeah. And I think one of the things I was thinking through too is that when people hear breeding, the word breeding or breeder, that's a big category, as you had mentioned. There's people that are doing it conscientiously, and then there's puppy mills. And sometimes that gets all lumped together. It's like this mass production of dogs, right? Oh my gosh, we're overpopulating the US with dogs. But you bring up a lot of good points there. And another thing that we haven't talked about yet is when we're getting more difficult dogs, when I say difficult in terms of behavior issues, coming into the system, either through poor breeding practices, which is one of the reasons. There's obviously a lot of other reasons out there, genetics, environment, lack of socialization, typical things that we see as trainers, is that sometimes people go to that shelter and they adopt that dog and it's got the behavior issues, or worse, they get bitten, or they are what they call outsourcing euthanasia. So it's a rescue that's like, oh, we have this problem dog, finally gets adopted out, and they try to return the dog after a biting incident, and the rescue won't take them back. And so now that person is tasked with the problem, right? So And guess what happens is those folks are like, I am never adopting again. I'm only going to get from a breeder. And so that's another part of this whole picture that is a challenge, and so let's get into, because there's people listening in probably and like, okay, we talked about what a conscientious breeder looks like, but let's get into some of the practices when it comes to behavior that you find. And maybe there's even support out there. There's been some studies done on puppy rearing and genetics, and of course we can get into that. But what are some of the best practices you're seeing in conscientious breeders to ensure these puppies are going out there and they're ready, they're equipped, they have resilience, other than selecting for temperament? So yes, genetics, but what are some things from the day the puppy's born up till they leave to go off to their forever home? What are some good practices?
I've seen a lot of breeders have different methods, and so I haven't really found one method that I can say like this is the way to do it. But certainly breeders who are giving puppies positive experiences from, very early on. So when they're very young, touching them certain ways. As they get a little older, we're going to start introducing different stimuli, and that can look different for every breeder. It can be, one breeder might use a stuffed animal in the corner, another breeder's going to, do it a different way. But starting to introduce these puppies to different scents, sounds, people, and then trying to make sure that those experiences are positive. So, you'll hear the breeder that I had one breeder that recently sent me a video of their puppies, and you could hear kids screaming in the background and running around and things like that. And it's like, well, you could look at that and say, okay, well, these puppies are going to be, desensitized to a lot of things, so they could be great in a home with children. But then you can also look at it and say, well, how positive are those interactions between the puppies and the kids? Because sometimes kids aren't intending for an interaction to be negative for a puppy. But how is the puppy seeing that? And if it's say it is a busy mom, and guess what? I've been that busy mom with puppies and kids and whatever else. And it was like a full-time job just teaching the children how to properly, handle the puppies and care for the puppies and things like that. So I think that each breeder's situation is different, and it's tough to say specifically, but I definitely want to see puppies that are, being exposed to positive experiences early on. And I think that a breeder, by the time this puppy is going to their new home, should have a very good grasp of, personalities of these puppies, who is a little more tenderhearted and needs to be matched with somebody that is going to help build confidence. Who is that really just confident puppy that needs, help with boundaries. So I think all of those things are really going to important. That first 8 weeks that, a breeder has a puppy is just so incredibly important. But, we can't discount the fact that leading up to those 8 weeks is important. And then extending past the sale for the life of the dog is crucial for those dogs that, may need a place to go at some point, or even, a breeder being able to, help support the owner when they need it, and they just need some reassurance, can be the difference between a dog entering a shelter or a dog having, behavioral issues, aggression, things like that. A breeder being able to step in when an owner needs that and recognize these things can make all the difference in the world.
Yeah. So it sounds like one of the key aspects is support, really, after, in addition to all the stuff you do before. But, that's a missing component I think a lot of people struggle with. Is like, what do I do now? And where do I turn? And unfortunately, this is why I think trainers and breeders and anybody in the pet care or just the whole industry should be talking more, because this is where the problem lies, is that there's a disconnect, and everybody's kind of like just keeping their head down and not talking to the other professionals in the room. And it's so crucial for that support. And that support can be with additional resources, with folks that are specializing in certain issues, or, something comes up with a puppy or an adolescent dog for behavior issue, and you have that support. And a lot of the pet parents are like, where do I go? What do I do? And I'll talk to my breeder, and then the breeder's like, oh, I don't know. And so, so we need these collaborations, right?
I think you just hit the nail on the head. We need these collaborations more than I think people realize. I think because, again, breeding is not necessarily seen as an honorable profession here. People are not having those conversations with them, and they have a lot to offer with it. And likewise, switching gears just a little bit, we have, a great divide between the rescue world and the breeding world. And I've built some wonderful relationships with people from the rescue world, and I believe that those relationships have benefited both sides mutually. I think that we need to start trying to bridge the gap and unify, breeders, rescues, trainers. We need to get everybody having these conversations together. And it's actually very interesting because, and this was, your brainchild was me setting up our meetings with these trainers that you and I had talked about. And it was really opened my eyes, because their perspective is very, very different than my perspective as a breeder. And so it's, I think, an important conversation that we need to start having across the board, just like with my rescue contacts, we are able to open each other's eyes, I think, across the board to the issues. And so it's just very important.
Yeah. So it's kind of thinking about that aspect, reaching across the aisle and understanding, viewpoints. One of the things that I think trainers and behavior consultants struggle with or see is when, I won't mention any particular breeds, but let's just use brachycephalic dogs, for instance, and we see some breeders just looking at the conformation, so the looks of the dog, and they're maybe thinking about health, but that health in selecting for certain traits in the dogs, it's causing the behavior issues, in other words. So let's just say the brachycephalics, they're struggling, some of them may be struggling to breathe, or, in a hot environment, they're getting stressed, or they're having trouble sleeping, and that's affecting their behavior, which they're displaying aggression because of those health issues. So I can see the trainer perspective lens on that, but take us through your conscientious breeder lens and how you address that issue.
Well, okay, so that's a very good question. So what we see is that, breeding is, although it's not treated as an honorable profession and it's not necessarily bringing in the people that are most qualified for it, what it is it's a highly competitive field. Anybody can go out and get two dogs and they can breed them, and then they can start marketing them, and you can have them on their Facebook page or whatever else. And so one way that a lot of breeders are standing out is by breeding dogs for a specific look. So when you are breeding only for a specific look, you are not taking into consideration health, longevity, temperament, and that is a real struggle in the breeding world. So, for me, with the German Shepherd world, you see people trying to breed for specific coat colors and things like that. And you also see that there are a lot of dogs out there that may have gotten that coat color, but they are missing the conformation, they're missing the health, they're missing the temperament. So that is something that we do talk a lot about with our certification program, is just, how do you still have that uniqueness that you're looking for in your program? Because again, we don't want every program to be the same. How do you still take all of those things into consideration and still get the outcome that you're looking for? And when you do take all of those things into consideration, the outcome may not come as easily, but it is going to be better in the long run. And again, likewise, when you've got breeders that are starting to understand that, we've got this cultural mindset shift, and we've got, people that are looking for breeders that are willing to be accountable to their dogs for their entire life, when a breeder now is accountable for that dog for its entire life, their decisions look different. Again, it's like, I want the long-term health. I want the long-term, temperament and the longevity of the dog and everything like that, because I don't want, those things going wrong, because I am on the hook past, the point of that sale. So, I guess that just kind of goes back into what I keep saying about this mindset shift, because we do need that, in order to help breeders understand, their long-term responsibilities.
Yeah, in in summarizing so much of what we've talked about, you kind of think, how do we shift that image for breeders, right? And my mind goes to, people like quality, right? And so creating sort of that brand reputation for breeders is important. Yeah. And if you think about it, it is business in the sense of people want quality, right? So it's like, if you're used to going out and getting cars and they're breaking down on you all the time, right? You're going to get frustrated. And so like, you're going to stop going to that used car lot. You're going to go to find, a nice quality Toyota that's, is going to last, because Toyota's built that brand reputation. And maybe this particular dealership does all of the checks and they support you after, and they do your oil changes for life and all those kind of things. And I think that same image shift needs to, and that's what worries me too about the training industry, is that we're also going through that, these dynamic shifts in the industry, where I'm worried, because people on the outside are like, what is wrong with these trainers? All they do is fight all the time. And they're like, everybody's arguing. I don't know who to turn to. And I can see how breeders are struggling through the same industry growth and shifts right now. So yeah. What are your thoughts on like increasing that image, like the image to get to like, it's an honorable like profession, as you mentioned?
Yep, that's the whole thing. So you bring up excellent points. So when you're thinking about, purchasing a puppy and you reach out to, 10 breeders, right? How do you determine who's a good breeder and who's being truthful, and who's just a slick talker, who actually is, doing these things? And so we've been working on through our certification program, through the app that we're building, and through our county pilot programs that we're putting together. We're looking at how do we prove and really make it so that owners can compare breeders apples to apples with information that is transparent, and it's information that is verifiable. And so, that's when we look at things like, okay, what were the genetic tests performed, and what were you doing to ensure that you have the proper temperament, and what do your contracts look like? Do your contracts, protect both the breeder and the buyer? Because a lot of breeder contracts are just this like one page, like, yep, you bought the dog for me and I'm in charge of everything and but you have no support. So there are a lot of things like that, and it's not an easy, not going to be one little thing that fixes it all, and that's why we are looking at this from the direction of the certification and the county level pilot programs. I think are going to be very important, and the app. So it's a lot of big picture stuff, but the goal is that these things all working together are going to be able to start helping the general public have a trust in breeders. And also, it's like, so if the general population is saying, hey, this is what I want in a breeder, breeders, if they want to be able to have, a market for their puppies, they're going to have to, be showing that they are doing these things. So this is how that cultural mindset shift is going to happen. And it's not going to be an overnight thing. But I think we do need the support of, the rescue world. Like, thank God we've had, a lot of support from, Humane World giving us just, words of encouragement there. We've got locally, we've started to really build better relationships with rescues. And I think that, again, that cultural mindset shift is going to take time. But that is going to be how we can start letting people see the difference between, or just actually be able to determine better breeding practices, looking for those better breeding practices, and see a change.
Is the plan for Herzog's here with this like certification to make it sort of nationally recognized, like this is the seal of approval you're looking for when shopping? Yeah, absolutely.
So, but in order to do that, we actually have longer term goals of in order for this to be that, it needs to become a nationally accredited program with an association. So there is a longer term plan in place that is beyond Herzog's Heroes right now, and we're working on that. And we're excited about the direction that it's going in. When I started this, I was looking at, how can I help support breeders? And I never would have imagined that it was going to take, the turn that it has. But to me, it gives me hope that we're going to see lower shelter populations and we're going to see, better breeding practices all around.
What do you, sort of like wrapping up some final thoughts here, if you could envision the perfect future for dogs and where we're getting them from in the US, what would it look like for you? Because would that mean complete elimination of shelters and rescues, so there's no need for it, which we know is probably, you're going to always have some need, but what's the future look like for Kate?
I definitely would like to see breeding not be a dirty word anymore. And I would like to see a unification between the rescue world and the breeding world, because I think that there is a lot to gain there from having healthier relationships. I think that the divide that we have right now is not as much as, everybody's a dog lover and their hearts are in the right place. Like, I think that the divide that we have right now is actually only, harming the longer term goal of shelter populations being reduced. But I do think that what we're doing, I think that it has the possibility to drastically reduce shelter intake. When you look at the numbers of dogs in shelters, a lot of people are like, oh, well, those aren't actually from breeders anyway. They're mixed breeds or they're this or that. But, accidental litters are from breeders too. We can support them to help avoid, those situations. And a lot of dogs that are in shelters also that appear to be mixed breeds or, whatever may just have been from a breeder that didn't have dogs with great conformation or were attempting to, create their own designer breed. So I think breeders play a big role in it. And there's a lot of room for growth here.
Yeah, very well said. Very well said. So what's the best way for people to find you? If you want to give a shout out to Herzog.
Yeah. So our website, herzogsheroes.org, is really the hub right now. We're building, online resources for breeders and for owners. Breeders can sign up to be beta testers for our certification program. People that want to really get involved can learn about how to start our programs, our county pilot programs in their area with our support, of course. And people can also find my book, Breed Better, Shelter Less.
Fantastic. Jump into the show notes if you guys want to learn more about and support this initiative. Kate, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time. It's been a wonderful conversation, and I wish you all the best with your initiative.
Thank you. I cannot thank you enough for having me here today.
It was wonderful sitting down with Kate and exploring this topic from the breeder's perspective. Conversations like this highlight how important it is for breeders, trainers, shelters, and behavior pros to work together if we want to improve outcomes for dogs. When we focus on thoughtful breeding decisions, early puppy development, and ongoing support for owners, we can help prevent many of the behavior challenges that show up later in a dog's life. And if you're ready to go deeper into understanding and helping dogs with aggression, visit aggressivedog.com. Whether you're a professional or a dedicated dog guardian, you'll find everything from the Aggression in Dogs Master Course to expert-led webinars, informative articles, and details about the upcoming Canis Conference happening this October in Schaumburg, Illinois, with both in-person and virtual options. Thanks for listening in, and as always,
stay well, my friends.